A man with a peculiar appearance abruptly enters a quiet cafe, his rigid posture and burning eyes immediately capturing the attention of everyone present. With firm and determined steps, he heads straight to Barron Trump, who is casually seated at one of the central tables. The stranger's index finger is pointed intensely, trembling slightly due to his apparent anger. Murmurs echo throughout the environment as customers try to comprehend the reason for such hostility. However, what seemed to be the beginning of a direct and explosive confrontation takes an unexpected turn. Instead of screams or accusations, a mysterious conversation begins to unfold. Every word spoken by the stranger carries a tone of philosophical provocation, gradually transforming the tense atmosphere into something profoundly enigmatic. Even the baristas, who initially hesitated to intervene, now watch with intrigue. The exchange of words between the two challenges, any initial assumptions, and everyone present finds themselves forced to reflect on the limits of their own beliefs. It was a pleasant afternoon in the heart of Philadelphia. The fresh air blew gently through the busy streets, while the enticing aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the half-open door of a small corner cafe. Inside, the environment pulsed with a cozy and vibrant energy. Conversations between friends, occasional laughter, and the delicate sound of clinking cups created an almost magical harmony. Everything seemed to invite passers-by to enter and lose themselves in that little urban refuge. Seated near the window, Barron Trump maintained an almost withdrawn posture. His tall figure, slightly hunched over a bulky book, gave the impression of someone who wished to go unnoticed. He wore an ordinary sweatshirt and worn jeans, pieces that did not suggest his prominent position on the world stage. To the other cafe patrons, he could be just another student or a young professional seeking a moment of tranquility. It was exactly how he wanted to be seen, as no one in particular. He had chosen that cafe to escape the weight that his identity frequently carried. As the youngest son of a former president, Barron had grown up in the spotlight, surrounded by expectations and criticism. However, there, among strangers focused on their own lives and distracted by their cell phone screens, he felt something rare: anonymity. That moment of quietude, with the light steam of a cappuccino warming his hands and the background sound of others' conversations, was almost therapeutic. While absorbed in the text before him, the pleasant hum of the environment was abruptly interrupted by a cutting voice. "You think you're better than all of us, don't you?" The phrase echoed through the cafe, generating immediate silence. Heads turned toward the author of the statement, a middle-aged man with a marked face and eyes filled with a mix of anger and frustration. He was just a few steps from Barron's table, with a challenging posture that drew the attention of everyone present. Barron looked up, surprised, not out of fear, but because the moment caught him completely off guard. The man, who appeared to be about 50 years old, was dressed in clothes that had seen better days. Although clean, they bore the wear of someone who had faced silent battles, known only to himself. "You have everything handed to you on a silver platter," the man exclaimed, his voice slightly trembling but firm. "Do you know what it's like to fight? What it's like to wake up every day not knowing if you'll be able to put food on the table?" The outburst carried more than just words. It brought an emotional charge that seemed to have been accumulated over years. The cafe, once so full of life, grew strangely quiet. Customers exchanged nervous glances, uncertain how to react. The barista behind the counter hesitated, hand hovering over the phone, ready to act if the situation got out of control. Contrary to all expectations, Barron remained calm. He closed the book he was reading with slow, almost deliberate movements and placed it on the table. He looked directly at the man, his eyes conveying something unexpected: empathy. "Sir," he said, his voice low but clear and firm, "I don't know what brought you here today, but perhaps we can talk about it." The man let out a dry laugh, full of incredulity. "Talk? You want to talk to me?" He shook his head, as if the very concept was absurd. "What could someone like you possibly say that I'd want to hear? Do you think a few words are going to change anything?" The silence in the cafe was almost palpable. All eyes were fixed on that interaction, as if the outcome was something no one could predict. It was a moment charged with tension, but at the same time there was an air of expectation, as if something extraordinary was about to happen. Unshaken by the man's hostility, Barron did something completely unexpected, a gesture so simple yet so full of meaning that it changed the dynamics of the situation and left everyone present stunned. Barron leaned slightly forward with a gesture that seemed almost intimate, as if he were about to share a secret. He took a deep breath, keeping his gaze fixed on the man in front of him, without any trace of arrogance or superiority. "I don't know your story," he began with disarming calmness, "but from what you've said, it seems it has been marked by struggles I've never had to face. If you think my life was easy just because I was born with privileges, I understand. But appearances deceive more than we'd like to admit." The man blinked, surprised by the response. It was evident he expected resistance or perhaps some kind of defensive reaction. However, Barron's serene posture and the genuine tone of his words cut through his anger like a sharp blade. He crossed his arms, still distrustful, but the tension on his face began to ease, though slightly. "Do you understand?" the man retorted, still with a challenging tone but now less cutting. "What could you possibly understand about hardship? You grew up surrounded by security, comfort, and everything money can buy. I had to fight for every piece of bread I put on the table." Barron did not look away for a second. He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the validity of the man's words. "You're right," he admitted. "I didn't grow up without knowing where my next meal would come from. I never had to worry about a roof over my head. But that doesn't mean my life hasn't had its own challenges. It's just that perhaps mine are different from yours." The atmosphere seemed to have changed. Barron's words not only eased some of the man's anger, but also sparked the curiosity of the other customers. Someone near the door took a step further inside, clearly interested in listening to the unfolding conversation. The silence that once seemed tense was now almost reverent, as if everyone was learning something about empathy without anyone needing to explain it directly. "Challenges?" the man questioned, raising an eyebrow. "What kind of challenges could someone like you have? In what way has your life been difficult, kid?" Barron sighed and leaned back, giving the man space, as if offering something invisible. "The kind of challenges that come when people look at you and only see a name, a surname. As if who I am is irrelevant and all that matters is the image they've created of me. Growing up in this world with expectations, judgments, and a constant feeling that I should justify myself for something I didn't choose isn't simple. But that doesn't diminish your pains, and I would never try to compare. My intention here isn't to prove anything to you, it's to try to understand what brought you to me today." The man blinked again, confused by the approach. He seemed to want to argue, but Barron's words carried a weight that made him hesitate. It was as if for the first time in a long while he felt truly heard, without judgment. "Don't you think it's unfair?" he finally murmured, his voice now lower, almost a whisper. "Some of us work our fingers to the bone and never get anywhere, while others start at the top." Barron, instead of responding immediately, remained silent for a few seconds, letting the weight of the man's words echo in the air. He finally said, with a voice that seemed laden with reflection, "Maybe it's unfair. Maybe the world isn't as fair as we'd like it to be, but what really matters is what we do with what we have. You've fought to the bone, and I deeply respect that. And if you allow me, I think those struggles make you someone much more resilient than many of us will ever be." The man fell silent this time, his eyes blinking rapidly, as if he were processing something. The room, which had once seemed on the brink of an explosive confrontation, was now filled with an air of introspection. The customers, once mere spectators, seemed to absorb every word of that interaction as if they were part of it. It was then that Barron did something no one expected. He indicated the empty chair in front of him with a slight hand movement and, with an almost imperceptible smile, said, "Why don't you sit and tell me your story? I want to understand where you come from." Barron leaned back in his chair again, his calm posture seeming to absorb the emotional weight of the man's words in front of him. The cafe, which had once been a setting of comfort and normality, was now imbued with the density of a painful revelation. The story the man was sharing was much more than a venting. It was a dark mirror of the struggles faced by so many who had been left behind in a world that seemed to move forward without looking back. The man, his fingers still tracing the veins of the table distractedly, seemed more vulnerable than ever. His voice, once filled with anger and sarcasm, now wavered between resignation and pain. "Do you know what it's like to wake up every day and wonder if it's worth continuing?" he asked without looking directly at Barron. "Waking up knowing that the world won't wait for you, that no one will extend a hand, that your struggle is only yours and no one else's?" The silence that followed was deafening. The other customers, once mere spectators, now seemed to wrestle with their own reflections. An older woman sitting in a corner discreetly wiped away a tear while looking out the window, as if trying to disguise her reaction. Barron took a deep breath before responding, carefully choosing his words. "I can't say I know exactly how you feel," he began, his voice low but firm. "But I can say that I admire your courage for sharing this. It's not easy to expose these wounds, especially in a place like this." The man looked up for the first time since he started speaking. His eyes shone with a mix of distrust and surprise. He clearly did not expect that kind of response. "Courage?" he repeated, almost mocking. "That's not courage. That's desperation. It's the cry of someone who has nothing left to lose." Barron leaned forward, moving close enough that his presence was felt without being invasive. "Desperation is also a form of courage," he said, "admitting that you're struggling, that you need help, that you feel anger and pain. That takes strength. Many of us prefer to pretend everything is okay, to hide our struggles behind a false smile. But you're not doing that. You're being real." Barron's words seemed to hit something deep within the man. He looked away again, but this time not out of shame. It was as if he were processing something he didn't expect to hear. The rigidity in his shoulders began to ease, and his posture became less defensive. The other cafe customers remained silent, as if fearing that any movement or sound could break the strange magic of that moment. The barista, who had considered intervening before, now watched attentively, eyes fixed on the interaction. The man let out a heavy sigh, almost as if he were exhaling years of accumulated frustration. "I don't know why I chose you," he admitted. "Maybe because you seemed so untouchable, as if nothing could reach you. And that irritated me, because I wanted you to know what it feels like to be crushed by the weight of the world." Barron listened in silence, without interrupting. When the man finished, he responded with disarming simplicity. "And now I know." The honesty of the response seemed to surprise the man again. He looked at Barron as if he were seeing him for the first time. "You're different than I thought," he murmured. "I thought you'd be like everyone else, but you're really listening." Barron gave a slight smile, but there was something melancholic in his expression. "I try," he replied, "because I think we all have something to learn, even from people we think have nothing in common with us." The cafe seemed to breathe again. The air, once heavy with tension, now felt lighter, filled with a strange sense of relief. The people who were once just watching now seemed involved, as if they were part of something bigger, something transformative. The man finally relaxed in the chair, uncrossing his arms and resting his hands on the table. His posture, once rigid and defensive, now seemed more open, more human. "I don't know what this means," he said slowly, "but maybe I judged you wrong." Barron shrugged, still with that subtle smile. "Maybe. But that's something we all do, isn't it? Judging each other before we really know the story." The man suddenly looked up, his face still marked by residual anger, but with a new spark of curiosity. "What could you possibly know about that, Barron?" His voice carried less hardness than before, but the distrust was still evident. The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the young man's response. However, Barron remained calm, as if he had anticipated the question. He took a deep breath, allowing the silence to settle for a few moments before responding. "You might think that everything in my life has been easy," he began, with the same disarming serenity. "And in some ways you'd be right. I never knew what it was like to go hungry or not have a roof over my head. But that doesn't mean I've never felt alone, misunderstood, or reduced to something I'm not. My name, my story, all of that to many people is a blank canvas where they paint their own assumptions and frustrations. And you know what? It hurts." The honesty in his voice seemed to disarm the man in a way no one in the cafe could have predicted. He opened his mouth, ready to respond with a biting comment, but stopped. Barron's words seemed to have struck a sensitive point. He stood still, his fists, once clenched, now beginning to relax. "Do you think being judged by your name is the same as what I went through?" the man finally responded, his voice wavering between skepticism and something softer. "Do you think that's the same as losing everything?" Barron shook his head. "I'm not saying it's the same because it's not," he admitted. "What you went through is something I probably will never fully understand, but what I'm saying is that the pain of being reduced, of being judged without being known, is something we all, in some way, face. It's a different struggle, but it's a struggle nonetheless." The tension in the air seemed less suffocating now. The man leaned slightly back, crossing his arms, but his defensive posture was visibly less rigid. He looked around, observing the faces of the other customers who were still attentively following the scene. Then his eyes returned to Barron, who continued to watch him with a mix of patience and empathy. "Do you really believe that everyone has their own pain?" the man asked, his voice now lower, almost hesitant. "Yes," Barron replied immediately. "I believe we all carry something that others can't see. And I think that if we were more open to listening to each other, even when it's hard, we could be kinder. We could find more understanding." For a moment, the man was silent, his eyes wandering around the table as if he were reorganizing his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was devoid of the previous hostility. "Maybe you're right," he murmured. "Maybe I've been carrying this anger for so long that I forgot where it really comes from. Maybe it's not about you or anyone else." Barron nodded slowly, allowing the man's words to resonate in the environment. "I understand," he said. "It's easier to project our pain onto something or someone than to face where it really comes from. But the fact that you're recognizing that now? That's already a huge step." The man looked at Barron, his eyes finally free of any trace of anger. "You're different than I thought," he admitted, his voice almost choked. "I thought you'd be arrogant, indifferent. But you listened to me." The cafe was now enveloped in an almost magical atmosphere. The other customers, once mere spectators, seemed emotionally invested in the outcome of that moment. The barista, who had hesitated before, now watched with a slight smile on her face as she silently dried a cup. Then the unexpected happened. The man extended his hand over the table, his gesture slow and deliberate. His open palm was a silent invitation, a symbol of something much greater than a simple handshake. Barron looked at the extended hand for a brief moment, then smiled. A genuine smile, full of understanding and kindness. He shook the man's hand firmly but without aggression. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice broken by emotion, "for judging you without knowing you." "I apologize too," Barron replied, "if I ever did anything that made you feel that way." The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but the impact of the gesture seemed to spread throughout the cafe. It was as if the simple act of reconciliation had touched everyone present. A woman at the next table looked at her companion, her eyes shining with contained emotion. A young man near the door smiled, visibly moved. When the man finally stood up, he seemed different, less burdened, less tired. He looked around the cafe, his expression a mix of embarrassment and determination. "I owe everyone here an apology too," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I came in here angry at the world, but this kid, he reminded me that sometimes all we need is to listen." The cafe erupted in soft but sincere applause. It wasn't a loud gesture, but one filled with respect and approval. The man looked at Barron one last time before leaving. "Thank you," he said simply, and then disappeared through the door, leaving the cafe with a sense of connection that no one there would soon forget. Barron returned to his chair, picked up the book he had left on the table and opened it again. But before resuming his reading, he paused for a moment, looking out the window with a slight smile on his face. Sometimes, even the most unexpected encounters can remind us of what truly matters: listening, understanding, and above all seeking empathy. What happened next might not have been dramatic in the conventional sense, but it was profound in a way that few there could forget. When the cafe door closed behind the man, it was as if the entire environment let out a collective sigh. Conversations began to resume, but something had changed. The room, once just a space for casual meetings and cups of coffee, now seemed charged with a different meaning, as if a silent understanding had spread among everyone present. Barron, for his part, calmly returned to his seat. He picked up the book he had been reading before everything happened and took a small sip of his now cold tea. However, before he could dive back into his peaceful solitude, a figure slowly approached his table. It was a woman with well-kept grey hair, appearing to be about 60 years old. She had gentle eyes that sparkled with something between gratitude and admiration, and a warm smile that seemed to light up her entire face. "Young man," she began, her voice soft but firm, "I just wanted to tell you something. What you did back there was honestly extraordinary." Barron looked up from his book, surprised. He wasn't expecting recognition, let alone praise. Before he could respond, the woman continued, "You didn't have to listen to that man, but you chose to do so. You chose to listen when you could have simply ignored or retaliated. And by doing that, you reminded us of something we unfortunately sometimes forget, that kindness and empathy can change everything." Barron gave a slight smile with a humble expression. He nodded slightly and replied, "Thank you, ma'am. But honestly, I think we all just want to be heard. That's all." The woman nodded, lightly touching Barron's shoulder, before returning to her table. As she walked away, Barron remained seated for a moment, lost in his thoughts. Around him, the cafe seemed to have gained a completely new energy. The customers, who were once immersed in their routines and distractions, now exchanged smiles, started conversations, and shared simple gestures of kindness. Someone held the door open for another person leaving. A customer paid another's bill anonymously. A young woman who was on her phone set the device aside to talk with the person in front of her. The cascading effect of the interaction between Barron and the man seemed to have touched everyone, like a wave of kindness spreading effortlessly. When Barron finally left the cafe, the sun seemed to shine a little brighter. Maybe it was just his perception, but he felt that the world around him had changed, even if subtly. As he walked along the busy Philadelphia sidewalk, he couldn't help but reflect on the impact that small gestures could have. He thought about the man who had left the cafe before him. He didn't know what awaited him outside, nor what life had in store, but in that brief encounter for a few minutes, they had found a connection. And that connection, as unlikely as it seemed, had transformed not only Barron or the man, but also the entire environment around them. "Maybe that's it," Barron murmured to himself, with a slight smile as he looked toward the horizon. "Sometimes we just need a little empathy to remember that we're not so different after all." However, this story is not just about Barron or the man he met that day. It's about all of us, about the silent battles we face, the hasty judgments we make, and the choices we have every day to listen instead of react. If this story touched something in you, take a moment today to practice a little kindness. It could be a smile, a word of encouragement, or just listening to someone who needs to be heard. And if you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can spread more understanding and empathy, one story at a time.